This is Teresa Clark with Africa.com, and today we have the opportunity to sit down with Kenny Fihla, the head of corporate and investment banking at the Standard Bank Group. Kenny, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you very much for having me on this interview, Teresa. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're excited to be able to speak with you on the back of the World Economic Forum, and just before that, the big announcement around Standard Bank's change in your climate policy. So a lot has been going on in the last many weeks that relate to this important issue. Kenny, coming off of the World Economic Forum in Davos in particular, what are some of the key messages for Africa in terms of climate change?
Africa will suffer one of the most severe consequences of climate change because of its underdevelopment, poor infrastructure, as well as the fact that the majority of its population still lives in the rural areas, i.e. is not in developed cities, despite the fact that its contribution to carbon emission is only about 3% of global emissions. And consequently, therefore, Africa must participate in the various developments that are taking place around the world to deal with carbon emission and climate change, and must also accelerate its own transition from brown energy into renewable energy, but do so in a manner that is sustainable and in the manner that acknowledges that this change is not going to happen overnight, and we need to manage, therefore, the issue of impact on jobs, access to electricity and energy, as well as ensuring that we can continue to improve the social standard of the people of Africa.
Now, Kenny, Standard Bank has recently revised its climate change policy, and we at Africa.com have been covering your climate change policy for some time. You've always been one of the leaders on the continent, leading in banking, and not just on the continent, but you've been a leader globally among banks, starting off with your leadership of the Principles for Responsible Banking, which you signed on to at the United Nations several years ago. Can you tell us a bit more about how and why you have evolved your climate change policy at this time?
The work around global warming is continuing to evolve, and consequently our own response to it is also evolving and developing over time. Our initial focus was to commit to doing something about our financed emissions, as well as the direct emissions that we effectively emit from our own buildings. And we took a bit of time doing an analysis of our own portfolio across the different markets within which we operate, to look at the concentrations that we have to fossil fuels as well as to other sectors of the economies of Africa, and identified 4 primary sectors as being at the forefront, i.e. having the most impact on climate change due to related carbon emission as well as consequential impact of global warming. And those are coal, oil, gas, and agriculture. Our policy, therefore, as it stands at the moment, sets out a framework under which we will participate or lend to clients within those 4 subsectors that I've mentioned. It also sets out a path to net zero by 2050, starting with coal, which will decrease much quicker than the other sort of fossil fuels, followed by oil. But we acknowledge that we need to have a transitional mechanism through which we can move from coal-fired power stations into more renewable energies into the future. And therefore, we consider gas as that transitional fuel source that will help Africa move from where it is into net zero by 2050. And consequently, therefore, our exposure to gas in the short term is likely to increase before it comes down. We've also made a commitment to accelerate the amount of lending that we do to renewable energy, and have set a target of between 250 to 300 billion in the next 6 years of commitment to funding renewable energy initiatives, green bonds, sustainability bonds, as well as support our clients to make their own transitions. In addition, we've made a commitment to be net zero in our own buildings, new buildings by 2030, and our old buildings to have been fully converted and to be net zero by 2040. And we'll continue to identify other additional areas where we could focus on initiatives and things that we can do and ensure as well that our plans extend to the rest of our portfolio.
That's quite ambitious. And then you also have another one by 2050 that you're aiming towards. You're going to be net zero from your portfolio of financed emissions. By 2050, you will be at net zero. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. At the moment, though, when you look at our TCFD disclosures, we talk about our overall sort of exposure and the percentage of lending that is committed to, if you like, fossil fuels relative to the total exposure. We would be evolving and moving that to focus more on financed emissions. The difficulty that we have at the current moment, which is why we're not talking about finance emissions immediately, is because of data collections that our own clients do not report their own financed emissions, that the measurements and the consistency of measurements of finance emissions across our different sort of portfolios is inconsistent and unreliable. And we'll rather look at that which we can accurately measure for now, whilst we develop the appropriate metrics and work with our clients to measure the actual financed emissions, and will then change and evolve our own measurements and reporting to reflect that specific set of metrics.
How did you prioritize the sectors that you have set goals for?
These are sectors that have the most carbon intensity. Coal in South Africa is by far the biggest contributor to carbon emissions. Our electricity, over 85% of the electricity that is generated in South Africa is still generated by coal-fired power stations. The two biggest polluters in sub-Saharan Africa essentially use coal to generate electricity or to generate oil. And therefore it becomes natural that we'll select coal as one of the priority sectors. Second to coal, oil is the second biggest contributor to carbon emissions. And therefore, just by looking at the priority list, we had to choose oil as the second subsector that we'll focus on. Gas naturally has a place, even though it emits substantially less than coal. It nonetheless is a fossil fuel that is still predominantly used globally. And if we're able to also manage the emissions that are sort of produced by gas or the use of gas to generate energy, we're likely to also address then the emissions that will flow from gas. Gas is particularly interesting in that in Africa, the bulk of our electricity and energy sources still remain coal-fired power stations, as well as diesel and petrol, which is derived from oil that is used in our vehicles and transportation sector, broadly speaking. Gas is particularly interesting because of the natural finds that have been discovered in Mozambique and the potential for those to transform and create massive access to energy within sub-Saharan Africa, as well as help Africa transition from coal and oil into less polluting gas forms, whilst allowing the rollout of renewable energy to expand and to suddenly and ultimately become the dominant form of electricity generation or fuel sort of supply. Agriculture then became the fourth natural sort of sector to look at because of the consequential impact of global warming on food security and the fact that over 50% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa still lives and resides in rural areas. You can imagine then what the social and economic turmoil of global warming is going to be to those communities that are still dependent on subsistence farming, as well as that still live in rural areas. And it became the natural that we should include that as one of the priority sectors. There are other sectors that will be adding in the next couple of years, but we think that if we're able to adequately address these four sectors, we'll be dealing with over 84% of the problem.
Well, it sounds as if you've put a lot of thought and strategy into how to approach these sectors and the policy overall.
We have spent a lot of time engaging with our clients, engaging with regulators, engaging with various stakeholders from NGOs to shareholder activists to other shareholders. And we have arrived at a view that we think is balanced, that has taken all of those stakeholder views into account, and is also grounded on science and what is pragmatic under the circumstances that are prevalent within sub-Saharan Africa.
So, Kenny, what would you say to those who look at renewable energy only, renewable as a solution, and that Africa has a perfect opportunity now to leapfrog to renewable energy?
We agree entirely with the fact that Africa has an opportunity to accelerate the rollout of renewable energy initiatives, that through distributed energy, we can give people access to a much more safer, more sustainable energy form. But we're also pragmatic in that the sort of connectivity to the national grid is still very, very limited, that the actual supply of renewable energy initiatives is still limited and largely dependent on government issuing tenders, awarding those tenders, and that the time that it will take for these initiatives to be rolled out adequately to be able to meet the current energy shortage, as well as be able to cope with the growing population and the developing economy, is going to be very long. And we can't say we're not going to do anything until such time that all of these constraints that I've spoken about have been attended to. We think it would be wrong to expect Africa to stand still whilst we're waiting for the supply constraints to be addressed and attended to. We think it would be wrong to deny people a better quality of life, economic growth, better taxes, as well as employment opportunities, whilst these constraints, are not being dealt with. So consequently, we have to balance then between accelerating our own funding and commitment to renewable energy, whilst at the same time recognizing that we still need to make a meaningful impact to economic growth within sub-Saharan Africa and make a meaningful impact to people's lives with regard to access to energy. It is a question of being pragmatic, being realistic, and ensuring that we balance the competing agendas that ultimately all need to be attended to.
Well, competing agendas, all that need to be attended to. That's a great segue to my next question. How do you balance the obligations you have to shareholders to achieve the greatest returns possible with, on the other hand, the competing agenda of financing, limiting your financing activities to green projects? How do you balance those two things?
We think that the two are aligned and not contradictory at all, that there are as many opportunities for renewable sort of funding and banking services as they are with regard to fossil fuels or brown energy sources, that our resources in any event are limited. And we need to prioritize in terms of which assets do we bank and support and which initiatives do we think are sustainable well into the future to avoid stranded assets. And in the strategy that we've adopted and the policy that we've announced, we have tried to choose a path that we think strikes the right balance between ensuring that we can continue to deliver shareholder value and the growth in the creation and generation of that shareholder value, whilst at the same time being responsible about ensuring that we fund things that are sustainable so that the shareholder interest is well protected. It will be irresponsible of us to fund assets that will be stranded in 10 years' time, because whilst that might be seen as generating short-term shareholder value, in the long term, it will be counterproductive and will be destroying shareholder values. If I look at the amount of funding that the bank has committed in the last couple of years, over 80% of our funding in the energy space has gone to renewable energy initiatives, which I guess support the point that I was making, that we have so many renewable energy initiatives that it is not a question of choosing between environmental sustainability and generating short-term returns. If anything, the two are aligned. And I think that will continue to be the case for the next 10 to 15 years.
So just to clarify that last point, if a highly lucrative transaction came along, financing a big project in the coal sector, you would actually just turn it down and say no?
We have limited to very, very strict and narrow sort of conditions the circumstances under which we will consider a coal project. So chances are that if a coal project was to come our way today, we will say no to, unless there are specific conditions that are met, i.e., if a power generating plant wanted to maintain its existing coal-fired power stations in order to reduce environmental damage, it will be irresponsible of us to say no to that, because it is in the interest of the environment for us to support them, and it is also in the interest of that entity and the economy of our own continent for that to continue to generate electricity for as long as there are no alternatives that would have yet been developed and connected to the grid. But those circumstances are very narrow and very, very limited. We are also attaching very, very stringent conditions to environmental emissions, to standards that ought to be implemented by companies and projects that we support, stringent conditions related to how they should deal with social impact, relocation of communities where that is necessary, compensation to those communities, strict conditions with regard to disclosure and reporting that they ought to do in order to enable us to have the view of how well are they progressing against the covenants that we have put in place or that we would have put in place in our own lending. So it is not easy really to lend to coal projects without necessarily ensuring that a number of hopes have been sort of overcome by the companies or by those who require our funding. And we're comfortable that by doing so, we're actually contributing towards the acceleration of the rollout of renewable energy initiatives. And we're also helping our own clients take environmental sustainability seriously and accelerate their own transitional plans.
Let's shift gears to looking at Standard Bank within the context of African banks. Now, we know Standard Bank is the leading bank in terms of presence and size and employees and assets. On this topic of climate change, can you tell us, do you also sit as the leader among African banks? Are you ahead of the par, on par, behind the curve? Where do you sit on this topic?
I think that at the minimum, we are on par. I mean, it's extremely difficult to sort of claim to be the leader, given that there's still a lot that is evolving and developing in this space. The terminology, for example, is still not yet standardized, I mean, across the different market. What people call a sustainability bond in one market may not necessarily qualify in another. But we acknowledge that our standards and our own execution plans are slightly ahead of the curve, especially in relation to local and regional competitors. We think we're also leading when it comes to the commitments that we've made to support renewable energy initiatives. I mean, I spoke earlier on about the quantum of 250 to about 300 billion rands that we're committing to spend in support of renewable energy initiatives in the next 6 years. That we think is by far the largest commitment that has been made by local banks into that space. The challenge now is ensuring that we can find the right projects with the right clients and that we can get those projects to a stage where they can be implemented and consequently that funding can be accessed. And we will continue to seek to improve our standing and to seek to improve the initiatives that we are embarking upon across a wide variety of spectrum, not just in lending, but also in looking at other alternative solutions that can be developed in partnership with our clients to assist Africa transition as quickly as possible.
Well, Kenny, let's look ahead to COP27. What do you think that Africa should be expecting to achieve coming out of that important meeting?
One of the biggest challenges that Africa is facing at the moment is the amount of funding that is required just for the continent to be able to transition from dirty fuels into renewable and more sustainable energy forms. Whilst all the financial institutions are making commitments to support that transition, the reality is that the amount of money that is required is way beyond what we can afford to lend as commercial banks. So clearly, we would expect that the developed world will also play a part and assist in meeting that funding sort of shortfall, not just in terms of verbal commitments, but in terms of those commitments translating into the actual flow of funds to tangible and bankable projects. And let me give an example. If one looks at the South African utility Eskom, which generates the bulk of the country's electricity, that utility is still dependent on coal-fired power stations. They would need, over R1 trillion for them to be able to adequately transition from coal-fired power station into sustainable energy initiatives. There's a backlog of about 8,000 kilometers of transmission lines that they ought to build to be able to connect the various initiatives that are being launched by private companies as well as by various municipalities throughout the country. Because unless those can connect to the national grid, that electricity cannot reach the intended beneficiaries or communities who ought to use it. So clearly there's a lot of money that is required to help Africa transition. And I think the world can really help a great deal if they were to accelerate their own funding and be able to partner constructively with Africa in managing the transition in a manner that is meaningful and in a manner that minimizes the impact on the economy as well as the well-being of Africa's people.
And so you give a great example and you speak about what is needed in terms of the cooperation of Western developed financial institutions to also come to the table. Do you think they will come to the table?
There are some commitments that have been made, which are very encouraging. Those commitments, though, have not translated into the actual flow of funds, and I think that's disappointing. We also think that at the moment, the broad sort of application or intended application of those funds does not have focused the funding to areas of greatest need. For example, some of the funding commitments that have been made to the South African government are intended to deal with electric vehicles, with assisting Eskom shift from coal-fired power stations into renewable energy initiatives. But we think that's a bit misdirected in that if you were to accelerate the rollout of electric vehicles in South Africa today, you would actually be worsening carbon emissions because those vehicles will still be charged with the electricity that is generated via coal. So the starting point must be to transition from coal-fired power stations into sustainable energy generation. Then you can roll out electric vehicles on the back of that. But to start with electric vehicle when the electricity is still generated from coal, we think defeats the purpose. And it is those sort of engagements that ought to take place and make sure then that the funding that is mobilized is directed to the areas that can make the most impact in helping these countries transition.
It seems like those commitments are not as well thought out as your policy. You've given a lot of thought to this and understand the issues quite deeply. I think that example around electric vehicles is an excellent example of perhaps someone with a good intention, but not a good understanding.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we appreciate the commitments. We want to encourage them, but we think more needs to be done to ensure that ultimately the funds are applied to areas where we can make the greatest impact.
I thank you very much for your time in sharing with us your leadership within the bank and within Africa around climate change. Your knowledge on this topic is deep and very instructive for all of us to hear. I thank you for sharing it with us and with our audience today, Kenny.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for your time as well, Teresa.